Hello and welcome to another episode of BioTalk. It's been a while, and with me again is Dr. David Prentice. He is with the Lozier Institute. What is your title there again? I'm just blanking.
It's Vice President and Research Director, but basically head geek.
Head geek at the Lozier Institute, which is a research institute. It's the what I think I've seen it described as the alternative to the Guttmacher Institute, which is the research arm of Planned Parenthood in the abortion industry. And this is kind of the pro-life alternative to that.
Right. Our motto is science and statistics for life.
Okay, great. And today we're going to be talking about stem cell research, human embryo experimentation in general, really, and because it hasn't been in the news for a while, but it was earlier this year. If you looked in the right places to find it, it wasn't very widely reported, but it was some big news in the scientific community, especially, and created sort of a bit of a discussion among scientists and researchers, but it involved this 14-day rule when it comes to embryo experimentation, and I actually wasn't too familiar with that. This was I don't think this is the first time I heard it. I heard about it, but I wasn't as familiar with it as I thought I should be when I was reading about it. So why don't you kind of explain what this 14-day rule is when it comes to embryonic stem cell research or embryo experimentation?
Sure thing. Good to be with you, Chelsea. The 14-day rule, it basically was an arbitrary limit set up for how long someone was allowed, supposedly, to grow an embryo in the laboratory. And it originated back when people were first beginning to think about growing embryos in the lab. People might recall that it was about 1978 that the first test tube baby, the first in vitro fertilization took place. So that was really the beginning of playing with human embryos in the lab. That supposedly was geared towards having lots of babies and helping infertile couples, but it really sort of began more for just, can we have a more easily accessible experimental route for embryos, human embryos. And so then in the 80s, there were more discussions about how much embryo experimentation would be allowed. And in the late 1980s and into the 1990s, people sort of settled on, after a number of discussions of primarily scientific organizations. There wasn't a lot of talk about ethics. And I think it's important that we keep bringing this up, because even in the current discussions where they are supposedly discussing ethics of research on humans, and especially human embryos, it's usually not ethicists, and it's usually not the public discussing it. It's the scientists who want to do the research.
You're self-regulating, in other words.
And in fact, I'll give you a quote here in a little bit from one of those particular groups that perfectly frames this. But again, what the scientific groups decided was that 14 days, again, 2 weeks, would be the limit that they would settle on. They talk about it as a consensus, as if everyone agreed. Well, obviously, not everybody agreed. This was just sort of an arbitrary limit put on. In theory, their rationale was, why 14 days? Why not 16? Why not 18? Why not 10?
Exactly.
About 14 days is when, as a human embryo, you start to form your nervous system.
Oh, okay.
You can first see what's called the primitive streak. And it's just sort of a line, if you were to look at an embryo, that starts to form. But it's the visible evidence that you're starting to form a nervous system. They've discussed that it's about that time that you can no longer split and become a twin, starting with a single embryo. Now, there's some variability even in those timings, but 14 days, had one person also said, well, for the Brits, it's a fortnight. So it's a nice, convenient time.
You're right.
But 2 weeks. Now, so they set this as again, an arbitrary limit, but one that they hoped that most groups would accept. It's actually the law in a number of different countries, including the UK. And in theory, you could be legally liable if you did an experiment and grew this embryo more than 14 days in the lab. For other countries like the US, it's a guideline.
Yeah.
It's, frankly, just a suggestion.
Right.
But what we heard, again, you referenced that there were these experiments recently, back in May, where 2 separate labs were able to grow human embryos up to about 13, close to 14 days. Now, why was that significant? Well, it turns out up until that time, no one had been able to grow a human embryo more than about 8 days.
All right.
So, back to this whole 14-day limit, people talked about that being a very effective ethical line. Well, not really. It's simply because nobody could do it. That's why it was a good limit. But now...
Very convenient limit.
Oh, extremely convenient. And in fact, so as soon as these 2 papers were published in scientific journals, you immediately had things like, here's a paper from the journal Nature, which is one of the 2 leading scientific journals in the world, about we need to revisit the 14-day rule.
Because of course.
Well, yeah, and they try and go through all sorts of gymnastics to try and say, well, it really was only a political limit, and it was just a convenient sort of thing, but it wasn't a hard and fast line. Well, we'd agree on that part because it was arbitrary.
Right.
My limit would be the 0-day limit.
Right, exactly.
But, they were trying to make out that this had been such an effective limit. But again, it was only because they weren't able to grow longer than a few days. And so they even bring up, well, we're not trying to say that we want to reconsider this just because it's inconvenient for science. Well, that's exactly why they want to revisit this. It's interesting, one of the laboratories who were able to go up to this 13 or so days, in fact, both of the papers made a big point about they stopped their experiment at about 13 days because they wanted to abide by the 14-day limit. But immediately one of the labs, in fact, said, well, we really need to change that limit and so on, even as a guideline or a suggestion. And it probably could only be set a few more days beyond that because nobody will be able to, can grow beyond that, and that's all we'll be able to get. Well, 14 days was impossible before those papers were published. So we're really looking at, again, what's the convenience of science? What could or should happen is really based for these different groups simply on what they think they want to do and what they think they can accomplish during this time. It's interesting too, one of the groups, and again, it's not a law, just guidelines, but it's called the International Society for Stem Cell Research.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously, these guys want to play with embryos, formed as a group of embryonic stem cell scientists. Now, they will accept adult stem cell scientists in, I should say that. They're very egalitarian. But they put together a bunch of guidelines. U.S. National Academy of Science has put together guidelines, and all of them pretty much don't really view these as ethics limits. These are simply scientific limits. Previously, they had said, yes, it's fine to grow human embryos in the lab for a few days and kill them to take out their embryonic stem cells. These are the same people that said it's fine to create cloned human embryos and grow them for a while and then kill them for their embryonic stem cells. So they quickly put together some new guidelines.
Oh, good. I'm sure they did.
And you can probably guess where this is headed. For now, they don't think anyone should grow an embryo beyond 14 days or gestate a human embryo, either in like an artificial womb or even in an animal womb. But that's for now.
For now.
They're very careful to word this, and they actually kind of open the door slightly, saying, there ought to be more investigation and so on. And we need to, right now, we're not pursuing it because of a broad international consensus. Well, again, that's simply because we can't do it at this point, but we want to do it, and so we'll look down the road. And I mentioned this quote. One of the authors of these particular guidelines said, self-regulation is the best form of regulation.
I mean, it's disturbing to me, though, how many regular people, normal people, will agree with that. I mean, I know so many politicians, especially, I've listened into enough kind of conversations in committee hearings and things where, even the politicians who are trying to determine some laws in some cases are like, well, we just want to hear the science. We don't, that's all we want to hear is the science. It's like they're so willing to let them self-regulate, to let them tell us what the guidelines should be, and then the politicians, even those some states and places where they want to make some laws about these things, they only listen to the scientists.
Right.
And that's that's the only guidelines they want to go by, or that's the only voice they want to hear on the subject.
Right, and part of that, I think they're basically shirking their duty. Yes, if you're forming policy, you want to hear from the experts.
Right. But
you also want to hear from everyone else who might be a stakeholder in this. And when we start talking about human genetics and the future of the human race, we're all stakeholders.
Exactly, yeah.
And certainly our progeny will be stakeholders. We need to think in the future. So policy is much more than just science. You have to consider the ethics. You have to consider what the public might think. And you have to also, I think, come back to, are there some just basic guidelines, some simple absolutes, if you will, in terms of truth, in terms of ethics, in terms of morality. I would like self-regulation too. I'd like to be able to drive my car as fast as I can.
Right.
Everyone would love self-regulation.
Exactly. But it's only in these areas of science and research where a lot of the public and people tend to agree. Oh, we should leave that up to the scientists to decide. They know best. I'm not a scientist, so who am I to say, what they can experiment on, or what their rules should be. And I think it's too many of us are kind of afraid of science, or it's like we think it's above our pay grade, and we don't know we don't know this stuff as well as the scientists do, so we feel like we can't have a voice. Some people do. I know a lot of people do feel like they're not qualified to have a voice because they don't know the science. Well, you don't have to know the science to know some basic human decency or ethics or anything like that. You don't have to know the science when we're talking about human life. When we're talking about experimenting on human life, what science says is one thing, and what ethics and morality say is another thing, and they need to come together.
Right.
They need to work together in order to be effective. in order to serve humanity in their greatest capacity.
And I think you're right. A lot of people are just scared of it. They don't understand it, and so they'd rather just push that back off on the experts.
Right.
But again, there's so much more to consider than just the science. In fact, it's important that people ask the scientists to explain what it is they mean in simple, understandable terms.
Right.
And so when somebody says, I want to do somatic cell nuclear transfer to get stem cells for cures, most people just heard that last word. And cures, who would be against cures? But what did I say? I said, I'm going to clone you, Chelsea, and then I'm going to kill your clone and yank out her stem cells to do experiments with. And maybe potentially somewhere down the road, we'll have something that, we might teach somebody. But mostly it's going to be creating and destroying young human lives. So people, again, need to ask the questions, get the explanations, and, be brave enough and courageous enough to say, look, I've got an opinion here too. And my opinion counts just as much as this scientific expert, because we're talking about human life.
Right. And we need to stay on that. We do, because they do get away with that whenever we back off. They start using scientific jargon for, what us normal people would call cloning, or 3-parent IVF, or whatever, or now it's mitochondrial replacement. Well, what is that? Explain that to me. What does that mean? Mitochondrial replacement, that's creating human life with 3 genetic parents.
And you've touched on a very important point there. Scientists that want to do these types of experiments especially will tend to throw out these particular terms, made up terms, frankly, and made up to make it sound better. And your example is a perfect one, the so-called mitochondrial replacement. Well, it's actually, you're not even replacing mitochondria, you're transferring nuclei. Well, wait a minute. That's cloning, isn't it? Yeah, it actually is. Well, and what are you actually doing? Well, we're making embryos with 3 different genetic parents here. Oh, wait a minute. Not so sure I'm down with that one.
Right, exactly.
And that's also a very good example about trying to defer to the scientists. A couple of years ago, our own FDA had a hearing on this very subject of 3-parent embryos. I went to testify at it. 2 days worth of different experts and so on, and each of us from the public got 2 minutes. But throughout that time, we kept hearing, we don't want to talk about ethics. We just want to talk about the science. So a number of us got up and talked about the ethics. But in the end, the FDA didn't even listen to any of that. And so it took a little pressure from some members of Congress to say to the FDA, you need to do an ethics review on this. Well, who did they ask to do the ethics review? The Institute on Medicine. A bunch more doctors and scientists. I think in all the various meetings they had over days and even weeks, there might have been 2 ethicists that they asked to come talk. The rest of it was more of this, including people who wanted to make 3-parent embryos, saying, there might be certain risks and we might want to regulate it this way, but let's go ahead and do it. And in the end, we worked with some members of Congress to put in just a few little sentences to say, no, FDA, you can't approve this. So this past February of this year, the Institute on Medicine came back and said, we might have some concerns, but we think it's ethical. What could you expect? And the FDA went, great, except, wait, Congress said we can't do it. We've got to get over our fear of the fancy terms and force people to give clear, understandable explanations and make our voice heard.
Right, we do. And that's what's kind of been a little disappointing to me. I feel like, just going back to the whole stem cell, with the new experiments that have come out, or the new reports that have come out with these experiments, what that tells me is that every time one of these reports comes out, the first thing I think is this research has not gone away. Like, there's far too many pro-lifers, I think, who think that we've won the stem cell debate. We have ethical alternatives. There's the induced pluripotent stem cells. Even some embryonic stem cell researchers have and supporters have said, yeah, these alternatives are great for regenerative medicine. Even Dr. Oz famously, when he was on the Oprah Winfrey Show, he said the stem cell debate is dead because we have induced pluripotent stem cells and there's so much more promise with this. And so I think far too many, even pro-lifers, we backed off this debate thinking that because it's not been in the news, but then every time a report like this comes out, tells me it's not been in the news, but that doesn't mean it's not been being done in science labs.
Right.
And it kind of scares me. I'm thinking, how many researchers are experimenting on embryos all over the place, and we don't hear about it until they write reports and publish reports. And so this tells me the research is still going on, and we're not as engaged in the debate as we used to be. And so that kind of disappoints me a little bit. I mean, we were the stem cell debate was raging like 10 years ago.
Right.
And it's just kind of backed off. And I think too many pro-lifers especially have become comfortable with the fact that it's backed off and think, that means there's nothing to talk about because there's nothing in the news, but it's being done in science labs. It doesn't mean the researchers have stopped doing it. And even with the alternatives to regenerative medicine, that's not the only thing they want to use these embryos for.
And that's a perfect point, Chelsea. Yes, it's not in the news, or embryonic stem cells and that part of the debate are not in the news as much. Mm-hmm. And partly because, in a way, we did win. We won the scientific part of the debate. Mm-hmm. With adult stem cells treating now over 1.5 million patients, with the iPS cells being able to use as lab models and investigating things that, frankly, even embryonic stem cells couldn't do. Mm-hmm. But the other reason it's not in the news so much is because, in a sense, the other side won. Mm-hmm. As soon as President Obama took office, shortly thereafter, he changed the guidelines at the National Institutes of Health and allowed more embryo destruction and more funding, federal taxpayer funding, for human embryonic stem cell research. And I think the embryonic stem cell scientists and the embryo researchers felt they had won and they had more money and they could kind of do what they wanted to do. So they didn't bother to listen to anything else. They just kept moving ahead. And you're right, they continue to move ahead. Now, embryonic stem cells pretty much were a bust. Right. And you do see a lot of scientists now switching over. Right. But in a sense, that was just a justification put forward. I remember hearing some of them talking about, back when the debate was heavy, embryonic stem cells were going to be the cure for all known maladies. And just kind of had to chuckle. But it was put forward, and it confused a lot of people because of that emotional pull. And so people said, well, yeah, maybe so. Well, now that it's turned out they didn't get anything like that. Right. And you see it turn to adult stem cells and iPS cells. Now there are new justifications. So, in fact, with this, let's go beyond the 14-day limit. What you hear is we can make embryonic stem cells better. We can come up with other kinds of cells just a little bit later in development. Of course, we're going to ignore the fact we're going to kill these young human beings to get their cells still. Or we can come up with ways maybe to help infertile couples, because we're going to study how the embryo grows, and we'll know more about how it might implant into the womb, and we'll know more about development in general, so we'll know how organs form. And again, they'll keep coming back to, we're going to come up with all of these great cures. Right. It's just a little bit different focus now, and we're not going to talk about embryonic stem cells as much. We'll talk about other kinds of cures, but it's still just a justification so that I can do, if I'm one of those folks, more embryo research, push the envelope a little farther.
It's and they're just going to keep pushing it, and that's what's so frustrating. You know, I remember back in 2006 with the Amendment 2 debate in Missouri, and it was all these promises where I was, we just want to go this far, and we don't want to give birth to a human clone, or we don't want, even they were claiming they didn't even want money. They just wanted it to be the law of the land. Well, then when it became law, then they were lobbying for money in the legislature. It's like they always make certain promises to get exactly what they want at the time, and then they're just going to keep pushing the envelope, because that's just kind of the nature of science. They want to experiment. They don't, you give them an inch, they're going to try to take a foot, and it might be later on down the road, but they're going to keep pushing the envelope. And,
it's good. You got to keep pushing, and again, this 14-day limit, this arbitrary limit, is a perfect paradigm of that. It's a good limit, and it's ethical, and yes, I cross my heart, swear that I'll abide with it, until it kind of gets in the way, and now I want to do something else, so I'll keep asking for more. So let's set it at 19 days, and then it might be years, but more likely not as long. Then we'll hear that, well, if only we could go to 21 days, because we think this is what's going to happen. But, we're going to come up with better cures and better treatments. And, it's an endless cycle, which, as long as you don't consider any of the ethics and any aspect of human life and human dignity, you'll continue to push that limit, which we brought up back when we had the Amendment 2 debate back in 2006, that right now you're saying, here's the limit, but here you'll come back for money. And you want to push it a little farther. And, and everybody said, oh, no, that won't happen. Well, it happens. And it keeps happening.
That's what they're doing. So I guess just in terms of this 14-day limit and revisiting it, I mean, is that something that formally has to happen with, you said it's mostly a guideline for places like the United States. Other places it's actually a law. I mean, how do they, even if they wanted to change it, I mean, it doesn't sound like in the United States they don't necessarily even need to abide by it. They can change their guidelines however they want to. I mean, that's a possibility, I suppose. But in terms of some of these other countries where it is a law, do you know of places that are revisiting it now, or has it just been has it just kind of been chatter since this is?
It's just been chatter and discussion so far, and kind of I wish we could do this and so on. You're right. In the U.S., well, for example, this International Stem Cell Society and their new guidelines, they're pushing that very hard all over the U.S. And I'm sure at some point then someone will say we should just adopt these throughout the world, right? Because they, as their name says, International Stem Cell Society, they want to be sort of the governing body, even if it's just suggestion. But for those countries like the UK where it's law, it probably won't take too much urging for them to put up something in Parliament and get it passed. Because unfortunately, they really never met an embryo experiment they didn't like. We've seen them pass not just creating embryos with egg and sperm, but you can get a license to do human cloning, you can get a license to make animal-human chimeras. All of these various things, they now also have approved 3-parent embryos, not just in the lab, but actually implanting those embryos, trying to get them to gestate to birth. And recently, they approved a project with the gene editing. So here's the next step, not not the mitochondrial DNA, the little energy factories, but our nuclear DNA itself that governs eye color and hair color and all these various things about us. They've approved an experiment to start doing that so far in the laboratory, but that'll be what's called proof of principle, to then take it and allow it to be done. And those literally designed, engineered young people be gestated to birth. So, they will, I'm sure, pose this first as an ethical study that will be done. They do that every once in a while. In fact, the UK Parliament recently did another study where they asked people to submit evidence to their committee, their science committee in the House of Commons, about stem cells and where to go next with that and so on. So I sent a bunch of actual published evidence on the efficacy of adult stem cells. You don't need to do embryonic, and said, you might want to emulate, for example, the Kansas Adult Stem Cell Center, where they're treating patients now, and they just, pushed all of that fetal and embryonic stuff to the side. At some point, someone will say, well, we ought to do the same thing with gene editing, and let's do a study, and somebody put a bill up, and we'll vote on it. It just doesn't take too much to push it right on farther down the road.
But there's no, in terms of our legal system, there is no policy being visited here on this, no.
No, I mean, we still pretty much only have what's called the Dickey-Wicker Amendment, which just says you can't use federal research dollars to do research like that. But state dollars, as in Missouri after Amendment 2, or private dollars, there are no laws.
We're still the wild west of...
we're definitely that. I liked the Wild West. It's very romantic, and you can kind of do what you want. But, come back to modern day, and when people are saying, well, self-regulation is the best form of regulation, I'll do what I want.
We're doing that
just give me some money.
Yeah, and it's not even just the scientific community. We've got the infertility community. They are self-regulating. We're the Wild West of artificial reproduction, just in general, even for infertility issues and things. And the level of experimentation on embryonic human life, I mean, just the creation, the experimentation, the destruction, when I think about all that goes on with that, and just a numbers game, like we could be getting into some astronomical numbers, and the sad part is we don't even, because it's not regulated, we don't know those numbers. We don't know exactly how much human life is being experimented on here in the United States.
You're right. There's nobody that surveys that. And in fact, even if you went through all of the published reports or the grant applications and reports and so on, you still probably wouldn't get a full number. But you're right. The best estimate I've been able to come up with, we always talk about the horrific loss of life in abortion in the U.S. since 1973, and we're up to somewhere around 55 million young lives lost. I think we're probably in that same neighborhood with human embryo research and the destruction of those human lives.
Already, and it hasn't even been that long.
That's right. I mean, you're looking at something that now is 10 years less probably, for the most part, than legalized abortion in the U.S.
I remember
but it's quickly ramping up.
Right. I keep trying to urge my pro-life friends to pay attention to this. You're sharing so many articles about abortion on your page, and I'm glad that you're so pro-life, but just look at what's happening. But hopefully we'll start paying attention. I think if this gets more in the news, like some of these things have been, I think some pro-lifers are paying attention. I think we're I just hope we get to a point where we can actually try to do something about it. Maybe.
No, I think you're right. And of course, the first thing is people simply need to be aware of it.
Aware of it, educate.
BioTalk is a great way for people to become aware of some of these significant ethical challenges that are coming up. And you're right, we need to, as pro-lifers, be aware of this aspect of the culture of death. That the attitudes that lead to abortion are the same ones towards human beings that lead to all of these ethical challenges with embryo research and embryonic stem cells and so on. And so we need to be aware of all those things. But then I think, yes, there are things we can do. And it never happens fast enough as far as I'm concerned. But call up your legislators at the state and the federal level and just say, look, if you're not aware of this, you need to look at BioTalk and learn about these things, and I want you to do something about it. You're my representative. Do something about this.
Yes.
Speak up.
Let's stop letting them regulate themselves.
Right.
and let's kind of add our voices to this conversation. It's so important.
Speak up for those who have no voice.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Thank you for coming again, and for all you're doing with the Lozier Institute and all you're doing. I know you are doing a lot. Sending your papers over, helping out, especially with politicians, helping them understand it, which is very important. And I appreciate all that you guys are doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Chelsea.